In 2016, Trinity Mirror, a UK newspaper publisher which owns the Daily Mirror, Sunday Mirror and the Sunday People, launched a brand new newspaper. The team came up with the idea after months of market research. Their research revealed that readers wanted a politically neutral newspaper, and to keep up with the speed of the digital age, the newspaper had been designed to read from front to back in just 30 minutes. Readers reported loving the new ideas, and the majority in market research said they'd buy it. It looked destined to be an instant success, yet 3 months later it shut down, racking up $1 million in losses. The CEO of Trinity Mirror, Simon Fox, placed the blame squarely on market research. He said, "At the end of the day, what consumers told us they would do was very different from what they actually did." Today's episode focused on why the traditional models we use for marketing and market research might hinder rather than help our work. I'm joined by Richard Chataway, who explains how many of these models are out of date and not fit to accurately explain how consumers act. Richard is Vice President of the BVA Nudge Unit in the UK and is one of the most experienced behaviour scientists in the UK. He's also just released his first book, The Behaviour Business. It's a brilliant read that provides clear frameworks for practitioners looking to apply nudge theory and behaviour science to their work. To start off, I asked Richard to explain why classic marketing models like AIDA, which stands for Awareness, Interest, Desire and Action, why these models won't really help a modern marketer.
The traditional models and the way we think about human behaviour, like the AIDA model, the idea that people go through this very logical process, very rational process before making a purchase decision, of being aware of it, then being interested in it, then desiring it, and then making that purchase, is that everything that behavioural science tells us about our attention, these non-conscious, more irrational drivers of behaviour, runs contrary to that, and that people do not behave in this kind of logical, rational fashion. The idea that people put as much thought and effort into buying a Mars bar as they do buying a house is just insane. Richard Chataway, again, he has an example in my book where he says, the idea that a consumer is standing in the aisle of a supermarket looking at a shampoo bottle, deciding between two different brands of shampoo on using all these kind of rational factors, you'd think that person was insane if they were there for 10 minutes deciding what brand of shampoo to buy. Our purchase decision making is much more instinctive than that. And my colleagues at PRS in Vivo in BVA have done a lot of really interesting work around, those more system one drivers of purchasing behaviour. The implications for marketing are obviously that, unless you have that understanding of those drivers of behaviour, and recognise that actually those purchase decision making processes are much more instinctive and less rational than we traditionally assume, then your marketing is unless you take that into account, then your marketing is going to be limited in its effectiveness.
The AIDA model implied that customers had to go from awareness to interest to desire before actually purchasing. And some of the world's largest brands have built multi-million-pound campaigns around this model. But the trouble is, it's nonsense. People don't behave in this rational, linear fashion. As Richard says, consumers might buy shampoo because they recognise it, or because it's the cheapest, or perhaps because it's at eye level, not because they desire it. The problem with these models is they don't lead to a consistent, predictable success. Instead, they might work once and then never work again. This is one of the reasons why marketers are so keen to change approaches and try something new every quarter. According to the Institute of Practitioners in Advertising, the average ad agency-client relationship has dropped from 86 months down to just 30 months over the last 30 years. Simply put, we crave new ideas, partly because the traditional models and frameworks we implement don't have a consistent effect. But this bias for novelty and newness isn't the smartest rule to follow. Tropicana opted for something new in 2009. After years of looking at the same Tropicana logo, with the famous orange punctured with the straw, executives started to think it looked dated and old-fashioned. So after months of research and $35 million spent, the team released a rebranded Tropicana with a brand new logo and packaging. But the new design failed. Sales dropped by 20%, costing the brand 15 million in lost revenue, while competitors all reported significant gains. Tropicana reverted back to the old packaging within 6 weeks. How did some of the smartest marketers and brand managers and product designers and executives make such a large mistake? These individuals aren't idiots, they are very qualified and they have a huge budget to spend. The problem is, many of the models and methods that these executives were taught don't accurately represent consumer behavior. One of the models used by the Tropicana team was brand archetypes. Archetypes are 12 different types of customers, for example, the magician or the caregiver or the jester. And these are used to help marketers better understand how a group of consumers might act. While thousands of marketers across the globe use these archetypes, Richard thinks it's just another model that's doomed to fail.
You mentioned about the archetypes idea. I spent a lot of time in my media agency career, particularly trawling through big data sets like the Target Group Index, which is the UK's largest kind of consumer survey, building these pen portraits of target audiences for use for our media strategy. So we would say things like, our target audience are aged 35 to 44, live in the southeast of England, like watching Friends on TV and drinking at the Yates's Wine Lodge or whatever it might be. Now, the problem with that is that, the more data points you take and the more examples that you use to build that pen portrait, the narrower that audience definition is becoming and the less representative it's becoming. So, there's an example I use in the book where every year when the Australian Bureau of Statistics release their census data, they have a pen portrait of what they call the typical Australian. And what they've done is taken the average of multiple variables, so gender, income, location, etc., to say the average Australian is a 36-year-old woman who lives in the inner west of Sydney and who shops at this supermarket, etc., etc. The problem is that they do that, and then and then they try and find someone to illustrate the article for it, and there's no one who fits that profile because you've taken all those variables and you've reduced it to the mean, and therefore that person doesn't exist. And the same is true of when you're building archetypes and pen portraits of audiences. If you build them in a way whereby you're taking the average of multiple variables, is that you'll end up targeting a fictional person.
The models that many of us use to understand our consumers simply aren't accurate. They don't represent an honest view of our world. This ambiguity makes it really difficult to find common ground with other marketers. You've probably sat at a conference and a keynote speaker has said something like, "Consumers are changing faster than ever in a world where technology moves at breakneck speed. Marketers need to move fast to keep up." Now, it's almost impossible for any marketer in the room to argue with this. Technology is developing faster than ever, so surely my consumers are too. But in most cases, these lofty claims simply aren't true. The inertia bias, for example, shows that the vast majority of us are adverse to change, unwilling to try new things. On average, people in the UK spend longer in a relationship with their bank than they do with their husband or their wife. So what rules should we follow when trying to understand consumers and grow our brand? Well, Richard suggests following the advice of Byron Sharp and the findings from his book, How Brands Grow.
If you want to grow a brand through marketing, and I would argue that is the goal of marketing is to grow your customer base, to attract as many people to buy your products. The most effective way to grow that is to make your product more attractive to as many people as possible, or as many potential buyers of your products as possible. Therefore, if you're being obsessively niche in your targeting, you can't do that. The evidence base that they have is to target what they call light users, so people who are maybe purchasing the product or service occasionally, but not often, because they represent the largest base of consumers or potential consumers of your products. And therefore, if you can incrementally increase the chances of those people buying your products, that will generate the greatest growth for your brand. Yeah, when we talk about it in behavioral science terms, we talk about satisficers and maximizers, which is a term coined by Herbert Simon around, for most people, in most of the purchase decisions we make on a daily basis, we're comfortable with good enough. We don't really have the time or the interest or the attention to spend hours as with that shampoo example, we don't have time or interest to spend hours poring over every purchase decision we make sure it's the best possible product that we buy, to be a maximizer in his terminology. For that reason, what you're best off doing as a marketer is targeting those people for whom it's good enough. The light users, the people who have a short, often very short list of criteria that they're using to purchase their products, many of which will be less conscious, more system one, less rational drivers. You're best off targeting those people because they are A, much more numerous, and B, the ones where you only have to achieve a small incremental impact, and it will actually lead to a lot of growth for your brand.
Becoming excessively niche, focusing on archetypes, or concerning ourselves with a subset of our market is limiting, and it will limit marketing effectiveness. Instead, we should broaden our thinking and instead focus on the largest possible market we can target. To help get our heads around this, Byron Sharp gives the example of Coca-Cola consumers. Now, when we think of the typical Coca-Cola buyer, we think of someone who will grab a Diet Coke at lunch, who will have a bottle of Coke Zero at home in the fridge. But these aren't the typical buyers. In fact, they are a very small subset of Coca-Cola's actual buyers. Instead, the vast majority of Coca-Cola buyers are very light consumers. 50% of their buyers purchase Coca-Cola just 3 times or less per year. So if Coca-Cola really wants to push the needle and change the bottom line, there's no point in targeting heavy users who buy 20 cans of Coca-Cola a year. Encouraging these buyers to purchase one more Coke will have very little impact on revenue. However, if Coca-Cola could encourage all of their light consumers to buy just 1 extra can of Coca-Cola per year, that would have a huge impact on the bottom line. And as Richard says, these light types of consumers are heavily influenced by heuristics rather than rational messaging, simply because they're such light buyers. So seeing a can of Coke with their name on it might actually shift behaviour. This idea that we should focus on light, heuristic elements of our marketing might sound like something that only works in cheap B2C products like Coke, but evidence suggests otherwise. Research by Gartner and Google looked at 3,000 B2B decision makers across 36 brands in 7 different categories. This huge study found that personal value, like professional, social, emotional, and self-image benefits, was twice as important as business value, the functional benefits and business outcomes, even in multi-million-pound business purchases. Clearly, we are influenced by nudges, maybe more than we think. Anyway, back to Richard, who gives an example of how he broke the trend of failed product launches and successfully launched the banking brand ING in the UK.
So in terms of ING, I guess the ING example that I use in the book is actually from quite early in my career. It was ING Direct was a brand that launched in 2003 in the UK as an online and telephone only bank. And so what was really insightful for that campaign was around how we could demonstrate or how we could cut into what was already a very competitive and very crowded marketplace, particularly as a brand that had no equity in the market. The team I was working on, or that I joined to work on that launch, and the agency I joined had built a strategy around, how do we kind of convey that permanence and security, which is very important for a bank, obviously, because people are trusting you with their life savings, but also really cut through in the marketplace and achieve what we call costly signaling, which is a concept from evolutionary psychology, actually, which is around if you demonstrate kind of visible health or wealth or virility in the kind of evolutionary world, then that is very beneficial. So Rory Sutherland has this great phrase about it. He talks about the analogy of the kind of peacock's tail with costly signaling, and he says a flower is a weed with an advertising budget. If you have very visible spending as an advertiser, and that doesn't necessarily mean you actually, are spending a lot of money. It just has to appear like that to consumers. What it conveys is kind of permanence, stability, effectively that it's a brand that you can trust with your money. So the way we did that as an advertiser was to launch the brand was the focus was actually not on TV, but it was actually entirely focused on large format outdoor posters, the big kind of posters you see at on the roadside at roundabouts and so on. And the reason for that was because they were completely unused by the savings sector, so we could achieve very high share of voice and cut through in that sector. And the second is because it conveys permanence, it conveys that stability, it looks expensive. The reality is to achieve equivalent reach through that medium versus TV, it's actually a lot cheaper, but the physical nature of those boards subconsciously communicated that kind of permanence and stability to customers. And again, it worked spectacularly well. The business achieved its annual targets within 8 weeks. The customer base grew incredibly quickly. So I think, the strategy, the costly signalling of that approach was beneficial in a number of levels. One, just because it broadened the appeal of the bank. 2, because it communicated that kind of scale and permanence. And 3, because actually the people it was most appealing to were the ones who were the better long-term customers who would stay with the bank for longer, and who also, frankly, would then be more likely to purchase other products in the future, like mortgages and loans and so on.
Richard explains that part of ING's success was simply due to costly signalling. By paying for so many out-of-home ads, consumers started to perceive that the bank was large, reputable, and secure. This theory neatly explains why sports sponsorships are so effective. They demonstrate high cost, and therefore create an honest belief in the strength of the advertised product. Richard and ING also achieved distinctiveness by using an advertising medium which was barely used by their competitors. But what if you don't have a huge marketing budget or a channel that's unique to market in? I asked Richard to share an example from his book which showed how KFC optimized their marketing message to appeal to more consumers than ever before without spending millions.
This was for KFC. As I say, KFC had an offer which was chips for $1. Very simple, very basic offer. That you could get a packet of chips for $1, which is 60p, something like that in the UK. And what KFC wanted to know was what was going to be the most effective way to articulate that offer to drive sales. And so what Sam and the team did was that they used a variety of behavioural science techniques and frameworks to come up with, I think originally it was like over 100 different articulations, or close to 100 different articulations of that very simple offer of chips for $1, which is insane when you think about it, that there are that many ways to say such a simple message. And then what they did was they tested those by running a variety of ads through Facebook, all with different iterations of that. And from that, they were able to isolate the messages that were most effective, the ones that actually, based on the engagement rates with those ads, the ones that were most compelling to people in terms of ways to say chips for $1. The interesting finding from it was that the most effective way to articulate that was to say chips for $1 limited to 4 per customer, which is a really interesting behavioural insight in itself, because firstly, it's basically a T&C, it's the terms and conditions. But just to make that more salient, you kind of leveraged a bit of loss aversion, scarcity bias, i.e., that we are more attracted to things that we think are in short supply. So the very fact that KFC are having to say we have to limit this offer to 4 per customer shows that it's a really good offer, and you have to hurry or you're going to miss out on it. And that proved to be hugely effective. They tested it in one market with some radio advertising, and it drove a huge increase in actual chip sales in that market.
I found that study fascinating because of the sheer number of slogans tested. You might be forgiven for thinking that using the scarcity bias in your marketing is a good solution if you can't come up with something more creative. But this suggests the opposite is true. The 99 other creative ad variants failed compared to this well-known nudge. For me, this highlights how important it is to get a basic understanding of consumer biases and heuristics instead of following textbook marketing frameworks. Before I finished my chat with Richard, I asked him about the potential implications this has for market research. After all, if we had asked KFC customers, what slogan do you like the most, they would never select the one that limits their options to 4 bags of chips. So what are the limitations of market research, and how do we avoid them?
One of the issues is what people say is often very different to what they do. And that's not because people are consciously deceiving or or consciously deceitful or lying to people in market research is just because of the nature of human memory. There's always value in speaking to your customers and getting an understanding of what customers tell you. My friend Lee Caldwell, who is an expert in kind of more implicit research techniques, he has a great quote: "That will get you 50% of the way towards understanding what's driving your consumers' behavior. But, why would you not want to use techniques that will get you to 70, 80, 90% of the way towards understanding that behavior? Because then that's a significant competitive advantage for you as a business over anyone else." And a lot of those techniques, as I've explained, are not necessarily cost prohibitive or difficult to implement. We're not talking about wiring up people's brains with ECG machines or anything like that, because actually, the evidence base that that's effective is pretty limited. What we're talking about really is getting to the difference between observed behavior and seeing what people are doing and gathering data points on that versus just simply believing what they tell you in market research.
People don't act the way they say they will act. Trinity Mirror's CEO realised this after launching New Day, and Tropicana's executives figured this out after their rebranding. The best example of this, however, comes from the National Survey of Sexual Attitudes and Lifestyles. This organisation surveyed 15,000 respondents in 2010 and found that heterosexual women claim to have slept on average with 8 men. Heterosexual men, on the other hand, claim to have slept on average with 12 women. This logical impossibility is the result of some people, mostly men, overclaiming and other people, mostly women, underclaiming in the data. Clearly, just asking people for their thoughts and their opinion isn't always best off, and where possible, it is much better to observe behaviour. Today we've covered how many traditional marketing frameworks like AIDA and Archetypes don't accurately reflect our consumers. We've learned that if you're launching a product, a marketing campaign, or a complete rebrand, you're better off targeting the largest possible market available to you rather than a niche. And we've learned that if you're conducting market research, you shouldn't simply look at what consumers say and instead try to observe behaviour as well. Follow those 3 steps and your next product launch will be much more likely to succeed. I'd like to give Richard a huge thank you for taking the time to come on the show. His book, which is brand new, is really brilliant and honest opinion on how to apply behaviour, science and nudges within your organisation. So I'd massively recommend anyone who's interested in picking it up. I've put a link to buy the book in the show notes below. I'd love to know what you thought about this episode and if you get around to applying any of these nudges for yourself. So feel free to get in touch with me. I'm available on Twitter @Nudge Podcast, and I'd love a review on Apple Podcast if you wouldn't mind leaving one as well. And if you haven't already, sign up to the mailing list by clicking the link in the show notes. Do that and you'll get an email every time a new episode goes live. Alright, that's all from me. Thank you for listening to this episode of Nudge.